In this video, temporary and permanent residency in Mexico. We're going to be breaking down the differences between temporary residency and permanent residency and the pros and cons of each. Because, surprise, surprise, there are actually some benefits of being a temporary resident. And of course, there are benefits as well to being a permanent resident. So in this video, we're going to talk about which one is better for you, and you can apply it to your specific situation. So when you apply for legal residency in Mexico, you have a choice of applying for either temporary or permanent residency. Okay? If you have a child in Mexico or you get married in Mexico, usually you're going to go directly to permanent residency. In those situations, I don't even think I've heard of someone getting temporary residency. Temporary residency is normally for people who are applying for residency via economic solvency based on basically having financial resources, savings, income, etc. And I actually have a dedicated video to Mexican residency and how to get Mexican residency in 2024. So you can go check out that other video on our channel if you want to know exactly how to get it. But in this video, we'll talk about kind of the differences. So the most significant difference is that temporary residency needs to be renewed at least once if you intend to stay in Mexico, whereas permanent residency never needs to be renewed and never expires. You might be asking, well, when is the renewal for temporary? It kind of depends. It usually is usually what happens is you get 1 year of temporary residency to start, and then you renew it for 2 or 3 or 4 years. There are some circumstances such as regularization where you might get 4 years off the bat on your temporary resident permit, but the most likely scenario is that you'll get 1 year off the bat and then you'll renew for usually 3 years, okay? So temporary residency permits last for between 1 and 4 years. Your first temporary residency permit is almost always granted for 1 year, and then afterwards you're going to renew. And then at the end of 4 years of total temporary residency, you can renew for permanent. So you can apply to exchange your temporary residency status for permanent residency status, or there's probably some circumstance where you can continue temporary. This is going to be up to the discretion of the I&M office, and things might look a little different, say 4 years from now than they are right now in 2024. But typically what happens is after 4 years of temporary residency, then someone would renew for permanent, okay? So let's talk about working in Mexico. Temporary residency permits do not inherently carry the permission to work in Mexico, but you can apply for it as an extra thing. So once you get temporary residency in Mexico, you can then go and apply for a work permit in Mexico. So it's not included initially or off the bat, but you can then go apply for it and have that granted separately. Now, you are allowed to spend 365 days a year in Mexico on both temporary and permanent residency permits. So you can enter and leave Mexico as many times as you wish on both, okay? Of permanent residency should be obvious, right? It's permanent, it doesn't need to be renewed, and you're that much closer to becoming a citizen of Mexico if you so choose to naturalize. But the obvious benefit of permanent residency is that it does not expire, that you do not need to renew it, and that, it kind of removes uncertainty in that sense, right? Because you don't know what things are going to look like in 3, 4, 5 years from now. The world of migration and residencies is constantly changing. So there's definitely a peace of mind to locking in that permanent residency right away. So what is the benefit to temporary residency? Obviously, I alluded to the fact that there are some benefits to temporary residency that PR does not have. Now, there are two big ones in my mind. The biggest benefit of temporary residency in Mexico is that you can drive a foreign plated vehicle in Mexico as a temporary resident, whereas you cannot drive a foreign plated vehicle as a permanent resident in Mexico. So what that means, if you're listening to this and you're Canadian or American, is that you can continue to hold your Canadian or American plated car, drive it down to Mexico, and you can have it with you in Mexico all year round. So how amazing is that? Let's just say you're from Texas or something like that. Maybe you're from New England. You can drive down to Mexico with your US plated car, and you can live in Mexico year round with that car. Maybe you have a car that's hard to get in Mexico, or you just don't want to buy a car again. You don't want to go through the process of selling a car and then buying a car in Mexico, which is definitely a hassle. Or you split your time. Maybe you do winters in Mexico and then summers in the US. There's a lot of reasons why someone might want to continue to have a US plated vehicle while they're in Mexico. And so as a temporary resident, you can continue to have that vehicle. As a side note, you may have heard that there is a certain designated region in Mexico where you can drive vehicles without importing them. And this region is the Baja Peninsula as well as Sonora. If I'm smart enough, I'll throw in a map here if I can find it of what that exact zone is. But if you're a permanent resident, then you're not going to be able to take advantage of that zone, and you're just not going to be able to take advantage of having a foreign plated car at all. Because let's just say you were driving a foreign plated car in Mexico and you whip out your permanent resident card. Well, they're going to say, well, that's against the rules, right? And then you're going to be in a kind of a weird situation where they might be trying to extort you, or make you pay a little fine, or lots of things can happen, right? So if you want to use a foreign plated car, the best time to do that is when you have temporary residency, and then you sort of need to plan ahead that when you become a permanent resident and you want to continue driving in Mexico, you're going to have to buy a vehicle in Mexico. The benefit of being a temporary resident in Mexico is this is a bit more subjective, but I think it keeps you off the radar of the tax authorities significantly more, right? Because on the scale from temporary resident to permanent resident to citizen, if you were American and became a citizen of Mexico, you're kind of on the radar a little bit of the tax authorities. Obviously, it's a complicated subject. It's a center of life test. It depends how much time you spend per year in Mexico. It depends on what type of economic activities you have in Mexico, if at all. And so, obviously a citizen is more on the radar, and therefore a permanent resident is more on the radar, and a temporary resident is a little bit less on the radar. So I think if you want to just kind of stay clear of taxation as a temporary resident, I think it's makes it a lot easier to argue the case that Mexico is not your center of life or economic center of life when you're only a temporary resident. But once you become a permanent resident, especially a permanent resident that's spending more than 6 months a year in Mexico, well, maybe the Mexican tax authorities can start to argue that, hey, this person, maybe their economic center of life is Mexico because they're PR, they're spending time there, and so forth and so on. As a side note, if you want to dig into this issue a little bit deeper, you can book a consulting call with My Latin Life. We'd be happy to talk to you further about how to organize things as efficiently as possible from a tax perspective in Mexico. So there will be a link in the description to this video where you can book a consulting call with us, speak to us directly, and we can help you build your internationalization plan. But yeah, just coming back to this idea of, everyone obviously wants to have a tax optimized situation and do things as efficiently as possible. So just on the scale, temporary residents are going to get away with more, quote unquote, or be off the radar more. Permanent residents are a little bit more on the radar. And then once you're a citizen, you're maximally on the radar. And there's actually some provisions and notes. I'll have to get into this in another video. It's more complicated, but they say, like, look, if you're a citizen of Mexico, you need to have a tax residency somewhere else. And you really, the onus is on you to prove that you're not a tax resident of Mexico. So basically, temporary resident, kind of the onus is not on you. Permanent resident, the onus is a bit more on you, but it's a bit of a gray area. And then when you become a citizen, the onus is definitely on you to prove that you're not a tax resident of Mexico. So in my mind, those are the two benefits of temporary residency. You get to drive a foreign plated vehicle, and then you're much less on the authorities of much less on the radar of the tax authorities, which is really going to help Canadians who are looking to escape the Canadian tax system. It's going to help Americans who are looking to claim the foreign earned income exclusion, right? So these are things that you want to consider. And again, book a consulting call with us. It's obviously a little bit complicated. Pros of PR, the pros of temporary. Well, what are the cons of PR? What are the cons of temporary? Cons of PR is exactly what I said. You're a little bit more on the radar of the tax authorities, and you cannot drive a foreign plated car. Temporary are that, well, it's temporary. You know, things can change in the future. As of right now, you do not need to reprove any of your finances, or basically like whatever financial numbers that you showed to get that temporary residency in the beginning. Maybe it was income, maybe it was savings. You don't have to reprove those right now when you renew a temporary or when you renew to permanent. But who knows, maybe in the future, they're going to start saying, well, we need to see that you still have the money. We need to see that you still are financially solvent, that you still have independent means, right? So the thing about temporary is you just haven't locked it in. And it means also that you have to come back to Mexico at some point. So you have this sort of future obligation. A PR never needs to come back to Mexico. It never needs to be renewed. It never needs to be expired. You just lock it in and you're good for life. But with temporary, you know that if you got the 1 year, well, you need to come back in a year. And maybe if you got temporary for your whole family, and we help lots of families get residency in Mexico, well, you got to haul your whole family back down to Mexico because everybody needs to get photos again. Everybody needs to take off work, take off school. And, you know, the whole logistical challenge of just being in Mexico within the designated time frame, showing up at the migrations office and so forth and so on. And that's, of course, you know, a little bit more onus if it's the 1 year. But if you're on the 3 years, you just kind of need to mentally plan like, okay, well, I'm renewing, I'm renewing in 2028, I'm renewing 3 years from now, something like that. And so you kind of just need to mentally think, okay, I need to go to Mexico like 3 years from now. And then the other piece of the uncertainty there is kind of what we're talking about. So if you haven't spent any time in Mexico in the past 3 years, and then you come back to Mexico to renew to permanent, renew your temporary residency, they might say, well, hey, like, you haven't been here at all. Like, why are we renewing you? What are we doing here? What is the purpose of this renewal? So right now, at this point in time, the time of this recording in 2024, they don't really ask that. They don't really get into it. It's pretty no questions asked. You just go in, boom, renewal, photo, new resident card, new expiration date, good to go. You're in and out. It's really straightforward. But who knows what it's going to look like in 2028? Maybe you hop into that office in 2028 and say, hey, yep, looking to renew. And they go, cool, well, write down here the days that you were in Mexico. And maybe they check it with migrations. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's an honor system. And you go, okay, yeah, last time I was here was 2024, 2025. And they're like, what? You haven't been to Mexico in 2-3 years and we're renewing your resident permit? Like, what do we, what's the idea here, right? So you can avoid that whole situation by just being a permanent resident and having it locked in. So that's kind of the downside of temporary, is just that you do have some level of uncertainty there. It's helpful in explaining some of the differences between temporary and permanent residency in Mexico, some of the pros and cons of each. I think that permanent residency is the way to go for most people. Lock it in, remove all the uncertainty, and you're a permanent resident of Mexico for life, which is an incredibly, incredibly valuable thing. If you are a driver, if you are a snowbird, I do see some value in holding on to temporary residency as long as you can, so that you can bring your car down to Mexico in the winters and kind of keep the same car in both countries and go back and forth. So I do see some value to that, but if you're not a driver, just go for permanent residency. Obviously, we talked a little bit as well about the nuances of taxes in Mexico. That's a whole topic in and of itself, and you should probably reach out to My Latin Life if you have further questions about that. But with that being said, I hope this video was helpful, and I encourage you, if you're still looking at residency in Mexico, if you're not yet a resident of Mexico, well, Mexican residency is an absolute no-brainer for Canadians, Americans, and really anyone that can obtain it. So check out our other video here. It's probably showing up on the screen right now on YouTube. Click this video, watch our video about how to obtain residency in Mexico in 2024. And we're happy to handle your Mexico residency, and we'll talk to you soon.